Today, we're going to hear from Kathryn Hogenson, and she is originally from Richmond, Virginia, a graduate of Emory and Henry College and the University of Virginia School of Law. She's been a researcher and an attorney. She worked at the International Teaching Center, at the Baha'i World Center. She was telling me how she was one of the people who organized many of the reports about the growth of the faith worldwide that were then submitted to the counselors and to the Universal House of Justice. Currently, she's a senior consultant for the Office of Community Administration at the U.S. Baha'i National Center. Because of her lifelong interest in history, she is the author of Lighting the Western Sky, the Hearst Pilgrimage and Establishment of the Baha'i Faith in the West, which was published in 2010. And she's currently working on a very interesting biography of Hand of the Cause of God Horace Holly, who was, of course, Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, on and off from, 1925 to about 1958, something like that. Truly a remarkable man, and she spoke about him in a previous web talk. Today, she will be talking about the material from her book on the first pilgrimage of Western Baha'is to meet Abdu'l-Baha. So at that point, I think I will turn this over to Kathy, and we will hear her presentation and see her PowerPoint slides. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us today, and we're really excited about this presentation.
So it's a great pleasure to be back with the many people who enjoy programs from the Wilmette Institute. I thought it would be interesting to explain a little bit about why this is such an exciting topic for me, because I had the great privilege while serving in the Holy Land for many years of serving as a pilgrim guide. And as part of that responsibility, we of course had to take the pilgrims to the house of Abdullah Pasha. And for me, that particular holy place was sort of like going home, because it was where the Western believers first joined in with the faith. And so telling the story of how the first Westerners came to see Abdu'l-Baha was always fascinating for me, and fascinating particularly for the Western pilgrims who were coming at this time in history. But what I also very quickly realized was that this was a very confused story, at least in the literature that was available at the time I was doing this, in the mid, around 2004 to 2006. And so I, having a little extra time while I was working at the World Center, wrote to the U.S. Archives and was very pleased to discover there were all sorts of untapped resources about that first pilgrimage, letters, diaries, and then a great deal of information that's now available through the wonders of the internet. So I began delving in this and found that the story has all the makings of a good Hollywood film. It has romance, it has a villain, it has the good fairy with her magic checkbook, and of course it has Abdu'l-Baha. So it is a wonderful story, and it also has mystical elements. There's a wonderful account from one of the Baha'is in Egypt. Many years later, Shoghi Effendi asked one of the elderly people who had lived in Egypt during this period of the 1890s, he was then a youth, to recount the story of that very important community, because the Egyptian Baha'i community, mainly Persian expats, provided a tremendous service for first Baha'u'llah and then Abdu'l-Baha and later Shoghi Effendi, because Egypt was essentially a British colony. Even though it was still an independent country, for the most part, the British had a very strong hand in that territory. And so it was a safer place for the faith to operate. And so many letters and the supplies and so forth passed through Egypt to and from the Holy Land. And the Egyptian Baha'is played a very important role in facilitating that. Apparently, a group of the friends from Egypt went up to see Abdu'l-Baha, and he said to one of them that he would like for that individual to interpret a dream he had had. And the poor believer put on the spot was quite embarrassed by this and said, I'm sorry, dear master, but I don't feel confident or that it's my place to interpret your dreams. He said the master obviously was in quite a good mood about this and laughed and said, no, I want you to hear this dream and tell me what it means. He said he had had a dream of Baha'u'llah. And in the dream, Baha'u'llah came to him and said that there were very important visitors coming, ones who had never come before, and that it was important that he received them appropriately. And so in the dream, he and the greatest holy leaf went to the closet where the good china was kept to get this good china down for the coming of these very, very special visitors. And so the master then turned to the friends from Egypt with a great smile and said, who were these people that were coming? Who was the master talking about? And of course, none of them hazarded a guess. Finally, he said, they are the Americans. They're coming, and we have to be prepared for them. This was several years before the first Western pilgrimage had even been thought of. So there are mystical elements to this. For me, the story is the story of how I and my people came into the Baha'i faith. And so it's very dear to my heart. The story really begins with two young men from Mount Lebanon who were Arabs. They were not Persians. They had had the advantage of Western-style education because the Presbyterian Church had chosen the Middle East as its focus for its international mission work. And so in Lebanon, they had established a series of schools, both elementary all the way up to university. Of course, the most famous one is the American University of Beirut, as it's called today, where Shoghi Effendi graduated. So these two fellows, Anton Haddad and Ibrahim Kheiralla, who we will talk about more in a minute, received a Western high school education through the Presbyterians, and then also attended the Syrian Christian college, which became the American School of Beirut. And they therefore were very proficient in English, but also they understood American Protestant thinking because they did not come from a Protestant Christian background. They came from more the Syrian churches, Christian church background, but they had this understanding because of their association with these American educators and missionaries. So Anton Haddad, as a young man, made his way to Egypt because even though he was married and had children back in Lebanon, there wasn't as much employment for English translators and English speakers as there was in Egypt because of the British. So there he was able to get work as a government English translator. And while he was there, he made friends with this slightly older fellow from the same area of Lebanon, Ibrahim George Kheiralla. Now, Kheiralla was a very bright fellow. He was also, as I said, educated by these Presbyterian missionaries. And he had had both good and bad luck in Egypt. He'd had success in business and then failure in business. He lost a wife, was widowed with small children, had a very unsuccessful second marriage, and he had decided that he had mystical powers and he wanted to pursue magic. So in the course of trying to do this there in Egypt, he stumbled upon the Baha'i community, and they very quickly told him to put aside magic and to instead told him about Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. Now, this was all done quite secretively because even though the faith was freer to operate in Egypt than it was in the Levant, it was still, they were trained as Persian believers who had been persecuted to be very cautious. And so they were very cautious in talking to him about the faith and told him to be very cautious and sharing it with others. So he would go to his friend Haddad and give him hints of what he was learning, but then also make it very clear that it was also a secret. And of course, how do you get people interested? You tell them that you have something very important, but that it's a secret. And this, of course, piqued Haddad's interest. So finally, Haddad convinced Kheiralla to introduce him to the Baha'i community, which he did. And very quickly, Anton Haddad also became a believer. Both men were looking for ways to get ahead in life. And Ibrahim Kheiralla was a very creative sort of person who used his intelligence to come up with some inventions. And he went to the embassies of foreign countries in Egypt and attained some patents. They were probably fairly worthless patents because the ideas were not particularly creative as we look at it today. For example, putting an advertisement on an admissions ticket. But he thought he could sell these and make a great deal of money in the West. It seems that the friends in Egypt offered to underwrite a trip of Haddad and Kheiralla to go to Europe and the United States to try to sell these inventions. And there's always been a question mark as to whether Abdu'l-Baha was also behind this effort or was urging the Baha'is in Egypt to do this underwriting. But nonetheless, they did. They were still very new Baha'is. Haddad had only been a Baha'i for about less than 6 weeks. And they also, as they were about to embark from Egypt, were informed that Baha'u'llah had passed away and that Abdu'l-Baha was the center of the covenant, the successor, the one appointed by Baha'u'llah to continue the faith after Baha'u'llah's passing. So with this very limited knowledge, a few copies of tablets, Kheiralla himself had actually received one tablet from Baha'u'llah before his passing. The two men set out with the blessings and assistance of the Egyptian Baha'i community. Kheiralla headed to the Soviet Union, to what we later would call that, but to Russia, to the court of the Tsar. And Haddad headed to New York City. Haddad arrived in New York in June of 1892, the very first Baha'i, as far as we know, to ever step foot into the Western Hemisphere. From what we know, Haddad did not try to convince anybody of the Baha'i faith. He may never have even mentioned it to anyone, probably because he was himself a very new believer. He had no luck with trying to sell Kheiralla's patents. Finally, he wrote to Kheiralla, who was also not having any luck in Russia. The Tsar was not interested, his court was not interested. And he asked Kheiralla to join him in New York, which Kheiralla did in December of 1892. Even together, the two men were unable to be successful at getting their business ventures off the ground. So finally, Haddad reluctantly returned to Lebanon and his wife and children who were waiting there for him. This left Kheiralla as the only Baha'i at that time in early 1893 in the entire Western Hemisphere. And one of his goals was to get to the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, which was where the United States would be celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus reaching the New World. Unfortunately, Kheiralla would not be able to make his way from New York to Chicago until after the Columbian Exposition was over. But it's very interesting, the interweaving of the story, because the Columbian Exposition, which was his goal in coming to the United States, also had a connection with the Baha'i faith and its establishment in the West. During that period of some months when the exposition was on, in September of 1893, the first World Parliament of Religions was held. This was the first time that representatives of a number of divergent faiths came together in one room and no guns and knives were involved. It was the first really peaceful attempt at coming together and discussing religion. Reverend Jessup, one of the main Presbyterian missionaries in Lebanon, one of the founders of the American University of Beirut and the schools that Kheiralla and Haddad had attended, this very eminent Presbyterian was asked to write a speech that would be given by someone else because he was not able to be in Chicago. And this very first, this speech by this Presbyterian minister ended with the E.G. Brown description of his visit to Baha'u'llah. It was the first public mention of the Baha'i faith and of Baha'u'llah in the West. And seated in the audience that day was one of the future disciples of Abdu'l-Baha, and at least two other future disciples of Abdu'l-Baha heard about the faith through that talk. The talk was widely circulated in newspapers and in the publications of the Parliament, and so it sent many people to libraries seeking out further information about the faith. Kheiralla made it to Chicago in 1893, and in early 1894 had established sort of a fraudulent medical practice because Kheiralla was a bit of a con man. I think that would be a snake oil salesman. But he had found that Americans were very interested in the Eastern religious practices as part of his the talks he would give as a way of getting his medical clients. And so he was able to get a small group of 4 people to begin what we today might call a study circle that was held in downtown Chicago in the June of 1894. It was at the home of William James, who was a grain broker. There was Thornton Chase, who was an insurance executive, Edward Dennis, who was a business owner, and then a British lady, Marion Augusta Miller. And Marion was in her 30s, never married, and came from a long line of, on both sides of her family, of British clergymen. So this group of 4 met in William James's living room, and Kheiralla began to give them lessons. The lessons were heavily based on biblical prophecy, and they led to the understanding that it was the time of the second coming, and that Baha'u'llah fulfilled the prophecies of the Old and New Testament. Toward the end of the lessons, they received the secret name, the secret word that would be their initiation. And that word was Allahu. And by saying Allahu, they became believers and would subsequently write to Abdu'l-Baha and express their willingness to be brought into the fold. Now, of that first group of 4, Edward Dennis did not pursue an interest in the Baha'i faith after an initial few lessons, but the other 3 did. And very quickly, as more and more people became interested in Kheiralla's lessons, he enlisted the aid of a young widow, Maud Lamson, to be the secretary of the group, and she began to keep a membership list of those who had gotten to the point of learning the word Allahu. And he refined his teaching into a series of 13 lessons. One of the people who embraced this his teachings, who had great potential as a leader, was a young woman from upstate New York, Lua Getsinger, as we all know her now. And Lua was there in Chicago studying to be an actress. She was living at the home of another one of his Kheiralla students, a Dr. Thatcher, who was a homeopathic physician. Her brother was there with her because he was also studying homeopathy. And most likely she was boarding at the Thatcher home in exchange for probably some household duties while she was pursuing her training and career as an actress. She and Dr. Thatcher had another friend that would come through Chicago occasionally, a young man from Michigan who was a self-taught scientist and made his money giving lectures on various scientific principles, which was not that uncommon at that point in history. He didn't have any academic credentials, but he was very smart and self-taught. And he also had gone through training to be a homeopathic doctor. At the time, the state of Michigan was one of 2 states that would license homeopathic physicians, and he had obtained that license through study at the homeopathic hospital in Detroit. So Edward would come through probably because of being a homeopathic physician, is probably why he knew Dr. Thatcher. And the Thatchers enjoyed entertaining him. Lua got to know Edward through the Thatchers. And the Thatchers had a weekend retreat at a farm outside of Chicago. And they invited the Getzingers, brother and sister, and Edward to come there for a weekend. During one of these weekends, Edward had a mystical experience, which was quite unusual for him. He was a man who was probably closer to being a pantheist or an atheist than to being a truly mystical, spiritual person. But he saw a series of visions, and later would come to realize that those visions were the town of Akka, the brother of Baha'u'llah, and the mansion at Bahá'í. In the visions, he heard a voice say that God had been alive and living in the mansion at Bahá'í, and that his son was there now. Armed with this strange experience, he told the vision to Dr. Thatcher and to Lua, and they took him to Kheiralla, who at first didn't believe that Edward would have such a vision. But this is why he was able to get Kheiralla's confidence and to start taking the lessons. Over the course of a few months after he began his search into the Baha'i faith, he accepted the faith, and he also married Lua. They then went off to Detroit and to upstate New York to see her family. And while they were in upstate New York and then settled in Ithaca temporarily, Edward saw a newspaper article about a philanthropist, about a woman philanthropist. And he had this intuitive feeling that he needed to tell her about the Baha'i faith. He found out very quickly that this was Phoebe Apperson Hearst and that she had a home in New York City. He wrote there. She wasn't there. He knew that she had a home in Washington, D.C., so he inquired there, but she wasn't there as well. So that left her palatial estate in Pleasanton, California, generally referred to as the Hacienda. And so he traveled with Lua's blessing by himself out to California. And it turned out she wasn't there either. She was at the time in the million-acre Hearst Ranch in Mexico, probably trying to avoid newspapers because her son was busy covering the Spanish-American War for his newspaper in New York City, William Randolph Hearst. And so he camped out for several months, and finally Mrs. Hearst returned home, and he was somehow or other allowed to see her. She was very interested in homeopathy, which is possibly one of the ways he was able to gain her confidence. She liked what he had to tell her, and so she invited Lua to join her husband at the hacienda, and there they began to give Kheiralla's lessons not only to Mrs. Hearst, but to also to members of her household. Now, during this period of the summer of 1893, Mrs. Hearst went through several personal traumas. She had already been widowed and was now the head of her late husband's business empire, so she had a great deal of responsibility already. But she was also primarily responsible for her parents and was quite attached to them, and both of them suffered some severe health setbacks that summer. But the greatest emotional test to her was that she was very attached to the physician who had attended her when she suffered a heart attack. This was Dr. Pepper, who was also provost of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and he was critically ill. So she invited him to come to the hacienda with the hope that California weather would help him improve, but instead he died suddenly. This really sent her into an emotional tailspin. Around the same time, Anton Haddad returned to the United States from his time in Lebanon, and while he had been back at home, he had been granted the privilege of visiting Akka and meeting with Abdu'l-Baha. And when he got to the United States, he wrote a brief account of his visit with the master, and this was widely circulated among the growing group of Baha'i adherents. When Lua and Edward read this account, they felt a strong desire to also go to Akka on pilgrimage. And Mrs. Hearst, who loved Paris and Europe, and also had a hankering to go to Egypt, they suggested to her that if she was planning a winter trip down the Nile, why didn't she also include a side visit to meet Abdu'l-Baha? And she readily agreed that this would be a wonderful thing to do. So she invited them to come along, and she began to make plans and to invite some members of her household. One of the people who would be accompanying her was her butler, Robert Turner. He was a Virginian born into slavery. As a young teenager, he made his way from the Norfolk area up to Washington, D.C., and had become a household servant for the Hearst while they were living in Washington, and George Hearst was serving as a U.S. Senator. When she returned to California, Robert and his wife followed her, and she had become truly her right hand. She trusted him implicitly and wouldn't go anywhere without Robert. So here are the people who left California in 1898 to go on pilgrimage. So we had Phoebe, Lua, Edward, and Apperson, who was Phoebe's niece that she was raising like a daughter, her butler, Robert Turner, her German lady's maid, Emily Bachroth. And so they headed from California first to Washington, D.C., where they stayed at the downtown mansion of the Hearst family. And there they picked up a few more people, because one of the other people in the entourage was a young teenager, Agnes Lane, who was a cousin of Mrs. Hearst. Agnes had some health problems and often had to be in a wheelchair. Mrs. Hearst had decided to bring her along on this trip, but because she was so young, she would need a tutor and someone to also assist her. So she hired a recent graduate of Cornell, Julia Pearson, who's through the associations that she had from Dr. Pepper. Julia was a very bright young woman and very qualified for the job of being a teacher. She also would perform secretarial duties for Mrs. Hearst during the trip. And then she decided it would only be right for Kheiralla and his new wife, because he had married that lady, Marion Augusta Miller, who was in that first group in Chicago. He had taken her as his wife, that it would be appropriate for them to come along as well, and they would join the group in New York. The group sailed on this ship, landing in Cherbourg, France. Mrs. Hearst loved everything French, and so she kept a very opulent apartment in France. And when she wasn't there, her dear friend Mary Bolles from New York would stay there as sort of the overseer of the apartment in her absence. And she had her two adult children with her as well. Her son was studying at the École des Beaux-Arts to become an architect, Randy, and then her daughter May. Now, May, from her early 20s, developed some sort of chronic illness that affected her ability to breathe, and so often she was bedridden. And when the party arrived from California, she was on death's door. Mrs. Hearst asked Dr. Getsinger to go and see May, assuming that as a homeopathic physician he could do something. When he came out of May's bedroom, he told Mrs. Hearst that she didn't need him, she needed his wife. So he sent Lua in, and Lua told May about the Baha'i faith. She said in a very loud voice, "I believe," and then promptly fainted onto the pillows. May became a very devoted believer, as we all know, and she was determined to go on the pilgrimage, even though Mrs. Hearst did not think that was wise because of her health. May was so determined that she started selling off jewelry. So finally, Mrs. Hearst reneged and invited her to come as well. Several other people would join the pilgrimage from Paris. One was a former Californian, Mary Virginia Thornburgh-Cropper, who went by Minnie, and she was living at the time in England because she'd married an Englishman as a 16-year-old. She came from a very well-to-do California family from Northern California, but they had moved to San Francisco and had been neighbors of the Hearst. Mrs. Hearst had already invited her to come on the pilgrimage because she wanted a traveling companion for herself. And ironically, Mary Virginia Thornburgh-Cropper had already run across the faith in a magazine article and had investigated the Bab at the British Museum. So she was already interested in it. And so she was delighted to be included. And so she and her mother, Harriet Thornburgh, traveled to Paris, and there Lua gave them the 13 lessons. Her mother, Harriet Burtis Thornburgh, was invited because someone needed to take care of May, and Harriet was really good at mothering people, so she was going to be coming when May came. Now, there were two other people who had not yet been invited, but were invited from Paris. One was another ward of Mrs. Hearst, Helen Hillier, whose mother died when she was young, and so Mrs. Hearst had had a hand in raising her. She had been part of those studying the faith there in California. And her school chum, Ella Goodall, who had also become interested, was invited as well. They were in New York at the time they received the invitations. They were getting lessons from Anton Haddad, and so they began immediately to make arrangements to join them in Haifa. Ella, by the way, came from a very wealthy San Francisco family, Oakland. They were across the bay in Oakland. Her father was an owner of a shipping company, so her father paid for her way on pilgrimage. She was the only one that Mrs. Hearst didn't know in advance and who Mrs. Hearst was not funding. Here is this wonderful note from Lua about her study class there in Paris. They had, when they got to Paris, one of the first things they had to do was write for permission to come on pilgrimage. And so while they were waiting for a response from the Holy Land, she was continuing the education of these pilgrims. And so you see we have Mrs. M.V. Cropper from California, Harriet Thornburgh from California, Julia Pearson, who was living in Washington, D.C., May Bolles from New York, Robert C. Turner from California. And she notes, this last student is a colored man and a most ardent believer. I think it's really remarkable to think not just that this was a racially mixed group studying at this opulent apartment in Paris, but this was women from upper class backgrounds studying with the butler. So on many levels, this was groundbreaking. Answer finally came from the Holy Land that it was not wise for them to come, but yet they could come in small groups and they had to do so secretly. The first to leave Paris were Edward and Lua. Ibrahim Kheiralla had actually gone ahead of everybody. He left straight from Paris, leaving his wife behind to go to England to try to collect her aunt, who was going to also join the pilgrimage, hopefully. But she never was able to. She got as far as Milan, had to stop. But anyway, Kheiralla went ahead. He was treated as a conquering hero when he got there because of the great work he had done. By the time he left New York, there were approximately 500 people who would call themselves Baha'is, or I guess we could say adherents of the Baha'i faith in the United States, and they were scattered among probably about 10 different communities by that point. So this was a tremendous achievement, which he was really due in large measure to Kheiralla. And so he was treated as a celebrity among the believers there in the Holy Land and showered with praise by Abdu'l-Baha, who gave him the great privilege of laying the cornerstone of the shrine of the Bab. So he had already had all these accolades before any of the Westerners ever got there. The first two to arrive were Edward and Lua, who arrived in the Haifa area on the 8th of December, 1898, and then had to wait for about 36 hours before they could actually travel to Akka to see Abdu'l-Baha. We don't know why he kept them waiting that long, but he did. They arrived at the house of Abdullah Pasha, and this is one of Edward's pictures of the house of Abdullah Pasha and the stairway to heaven, as the pilgrims would call it, the flight of stairs you went up to reach his apartments. They arrived in this wonderful Birani on December the 10th, 1898. Now, the very interesting thing is that most historians today now talk about the 20th century as the American century. And it has that title because during that period, the American nation became the ascendant nation of the world, the most important nation of the world. And almost all historians agree that the American century began with the end of the Spanish-American War. That was the turning point that made the United States truly a world power. We gained Puerto Rico as a colony and the Philippines as a colony, and had essentially kicked Spain out of the Western Hemisphere. William Randolph Hearst, Phoebe's only child, it was widely credited at the time with the war even happening. His newspaper or newspapers created an environment that made it impossible for President McKinley to not go to war. So he has often been given credit for starting that war. His mother also was the one who brought the pilgrims to the Holy Land. The signing of the peace treaty ending that war and establishing the American century occurred in Paris on December the 10th, 1898, the same morning that the first Americans reached Abdu'l-Baha. So the American century began exactly at the same time as the first Americans reaching Abdu'l-Baha. Undoubtedly, the meeting took place in this room. They were amazed, overcome with feelings that they couldn't articulate. They both wept, but they had expected a prince in an earthly sense and instead found a man in very humble surroundings, but just so majestic and just so loving. They had never experienced anything like this. And of course, their hearts were on fire. They spent a few days with Abdu'l-Baha, then returned to Haifa. And I'm not 100% certain, but it seems probable that Edward then went back to Egypt to help fetch Mrs. Hearst, who traveled to Haifa with Emily Bachrodt, her maid, and with Mary Virginia Thornburgh-Cropper. And you will find a wonderful account of that in Chosen Highway, of their time there, very brief though it was. They then left and returned to Egypt, where the rest of the group was assembling, including some people who were not interested in the Baha'i faith, but were part of the Hearst entourage. They were going to celebrate Christmas there in Egypt. And but the interesting thing is, the Getzingers were not asked to leave. So they stayed until after Nowruz. So they were there for almost three and a half, almost 4 months, nonstop. Next to arrive was Marion Miller Kheiralla, who had, as I said, made a side trip to England. And then we started having the other members of the group slowly come up from Egypt. We had Julia Pearson came with Ann Apperson and Robert Turner. And then almost as soon as they left, Ella and Helen showed up. Now, in addition to those folks, there was one surprise pilgrim who showed up toward the end of the pilgrimage. And that was a lady from Ohio who had heard about the faith, but had not ever had any contact whatsoever with Mrs. Hearst or her party. And this dear soul was very important because she stayed very steadfast, and members of her family would become Baha'is. And right now, I'm trying to see if I have I don't think I have a slide. So one of the issues has always been exactly how many pilgrims were there, and whether we count this extra person is always a bit of a question, but she's the one who makes it the right number.
Mrs. Peak.
Mrs. Peak, I was sorry. Margaret
Bloodgood
Peak, yes. Here we have the only picture of a group picture that Edward Getsinger took, and most of his pictures, unfortunately, were out of focus. But we know that Mrs. Hearst is in this picture, and the reason is this very tall lady here is Mary Virginia Thornburgh-Cropper. She was almost 6 feet tall, and so her height gives her away. Here we have the group in Egypt, in between going back and forth to the Holy Land with Mrs. Hearst. And here's Mary Virginia, Robert Turner, the maid Amelie Buckroat, the niece Agnes Lane, Anne Apperson. This is another lady who's traveling with them. Julia Pearson. Now, when the pilgrims left, some of them lingered in Europe for a bit. So they arrived in drivels coming back. Kheiralla realized that the friends who had, particularly the Getzingers, who had spent so much time with Abdu'l-Baha, had figured out that many of the things that he had told them were not true. And so he hurried back to the United States. He also realized that Abdu'l-Baha was not going to let him be in charge of the American Baha'i community, that he would not have a special place, and that he would also not be given a livelihood for teaching full-time in the United States. He wanted Abdu'l-Baha to order Mrs. Hearst or other wealthy believers to support him and his family, and that just wasn't going to happen. And so he rushed back to the United States and began to spread rumors to start casting doubt in the hearts of the friends, particularly beginning in the New York community. So when Edward and Lua returned, they returned to a very cold reception. And by the time Mrs. Hearst got back, it was quite clear what was going on. So Mrs. Hearst very quickly dispatched Anton Haddad back to the Holy Land, where he was able to spend several weeks with Abdu'l-Baha, who dictated to him exactly the message that the American community needed to hear in order to be firm in the covenant. And this is really the Master's first message to the American Baha'i community. It's called Message from Akka. We have an unofficial translation of it, but it was all given in Arabic, and apparently Abdu'l-Baha would correct Haddad's notes to make sure that everything he was getting was exactly the way Abdu'l-Baha wanted to say it. So he comes back with this information from Abdu'l-Baha that is very quickly published and circulated, and then Abul Karim Tirani, the Egyptian believer who was the primary teacher of Kheiralla, also comes bringing a couple of people to assist him and to translate, and they begin to have a showdown with Kheiralla. This is very complicated. It goes on for a period of time. I'm obviously summarizing all of this because of our time constraints, but here we have Tirani with some of the New York believers, and here's Lua and Edward on the far right. We have Haddad here on the left, Thornton Chase down on the front, and then Arthur Pillsbury Dodge up here in the back, one of the man who really brought the faith to New York. Kheiralla finally shows his true colors, that he wanted to usurp the role of Abdu'l-Baha in the United States and to have his own faith, essentially. And so this caused a split in the American community. Edward and Lua, as well as Haddad and Thornton Chase, began to travel throughout the United States to visit the Baha'i communities and to shore them up. And only in a few cases were they unsuccessful. Fortunately, many communities had had little or no contact with Kheiralla. The Master began to send other Persian believers to, as you see here, this is a Sigillah, his brother-in-law, to help deepen the American community. This is Chicago, I think, in front of the Thatcher home. And then he sent the most erudite, probably the greatest of all Baha'i scholars, Mirza Abul-Fadl, to the United States in the company of a young Persian who had learned English, Ali Quli Khan. And he was given the task, Mirza Abul-Fadl, of writing a general history of the faith and its teachings for Western believers. And this was to be translated by Ali Quli Khan. So even though this was an amazing task, and even as much as he was recognized as a leading scholar, not just in Islamic and Baha'i teachings, but in world religions, he did not feel adequate to it. And Ali Quli Khan commented that he sort of had to pull it out of him. So this finally helped give the Friends a proper basic understanding of the tenets of the Baha'i faith. Finally, of course, the Master himself arrived, and the Baha'i faith in the United States was at last on firm footing. Here he is with the Friends in Chicago, and in front of the Goodall home in California. Now, what happened to the people privileged to go on that first pilgrimage? Well, here we have Mrs. Hearst with her niece Ann Apperson and her cousin Agnes Lane, and all three of them stayed devoted believers to the end of their lives. Anne and Agnes both were somewhat circumscribed in their ability to be active believers because of their husbands. Mrs. Hearst, as many of you know, had the privilege of entertaining the Master at her home, the Hacienda, when he came to California in 1912. The general story is that she was then estranged from the faith because Dr. Farid hit her up for money under the pretense of doing so for Abdu'l-Baha. I have not seen anything in writing about that, and I think most of the information about that incident came from the Persian members of the entourage. The problem with Mrs. Hearst was that almost as soon as she came back from the pilgrimage, other people in the American community began to look to her for money. And she just did not like being treated as though she was nothing more than a checkbook. Also, Lua did something that Lua was very impatient. She wanted Mrs. Hearst to be more public about her adherence to the Baha'i faith. And Mrs. Hearst was not ready to do that for a wide variety of reasons, not the least which was the fact that her son was about to run for president. And I suspect also she and Abdu'l-Baha both understood that the more public her connection to the faith was, the more it could hurt him as well as her. So she backed off, but not in the true sense of not being a believer. She continued to keep very close associations with a number of Baha'is, particularly she hired Ali Quli Khan to work for her, and she also retained a very good friendship with Helen Goodall and Ella Goodall Cooper, and retained that friendship with Ella to the very end of her life. So she kept Baha'i books in her bedroom, and most likely was in touch with Abdu'l-Baha. I think that the letters, according to Marcia Gale, the correspondence Mrs. Hearst kept on with Abdu'l-Baha during these years where she was less involved with the actual meetings of the faith in the United States, were primarily through Ali Quli Khan, and I think only when we can get into his papers at the World Center will we be able to see that relationship there. So as to the other members, May, of course, became the mother of the French Baha'i community, and then the mother of the Canadian Baha'i community, and married a young student, was studying at architecture in Paris with her brother, William Sutherland Maxwell, who would also later become a hand of the cause of God. And of course, their daughter, Rihia Khanum, was the wife of Shoghi Effendi and another hand of the cause. Lua, mother teacher of the West, would travel throughout the United States and then later would go to India to help spread the faith, dying in Egypt and being buried next to Mirza Abul Fadl. Edward Getsinger ultimately ended up in a little place called Hollywood in California. He was always active in the faith, but became less so at the national level over time. He was someone who sort of liked to do things his own way, and as the administrative order grew in importance, he found it difficult to be under the authority of institutions, but never wavered in his devotion to the faith and continued to teach it from his home in California. The other members of the pilgrimage, for the most part, stayed devoted in their hearts, but some of them did not become devoted, active members of the faith later. Many of them were young women who were single at the time of the pilgrimage, and because of their marriages, had difficulty being involved later in life. Julia Pearson, for example, many years later, one of the May Bolles Maxwell's sister-in-law made a visit to her, and Julia wept, remembering the pilgrimage and learning what had happened with the faith, but due to her marriage had never retained an association with it. So it's very interesting, except for Kheiralla, who broke the covenant, most of them retained a strong interest. His wife, Marion Miller Kheiralla, divorced Kheiralla as soon as she returned to the United States, and was very active for a few years in the faith, but then fell away for reasons that I have not been able to find, and ultimately returned to Christianity and to her native England. As far as we know, Robert Turner was devoted to the very end and was ultimately named a disciple of Abdu'l-Baha, and the maid, Emily Bachrodt, continued to attend meetings at the Goodall home and stayed a devoted believer to the end of her life. As for Mrs. Hearst, as she was dying as a result of having contracted the terrible Asian flu that afflicted the entire planet in 1919 at the end of World War I, she had Ella come and visit her. And during the visit, said the greatest name again nine times, a sort of reaffirmation of her faith. And Ella wrote to Abdu'l-Baha and gave him almost a blow-by-blow account of her last visit with Mrs. Hearst. And the master sent a beautiful tablet to Ella talking about Mrs. Hearst and in her honor. And this is in my book. I won't take the time to read it, but he makes it very clear that she died a confirmed believer. He also stated that even though her worth was not known at the time, that it would be in the future. Now, Ella sent those two tablets to the U.S. National Archives some years later, and she asked that they not be circulated because the Hearst family was not happy that Anne Apperson Flint was still a Baha'i. And so for Anne's sake, she asked that this connection of Mrs. Hearst with the faith not be publicized. At this point, obviously, Mrs. Flint has been dead since the 1970s, and so it is finally, I think, timely for the world to know that Mrs. Hearst was, in fact, a devoted and confirmed believer. I'm sure that there are many questions out there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathy. It's a breathtaking summary of the history of the faith, of the pilgrimage, of the people, and the impact that it had on them, especially people like May Bolles, who were just overwhelmed by meeting Abdu'l-Baha. And Helen Hillier, if I remember, also wrote some incredible descriptions of meeting Abdu'l-Baha. So their descriptions are just, to this day, I think they can just take your breath away to read them. Are really very inspiring. Let me see what we have here in terms of comments and questions. See if I can't make it big enough so I can read it. At the moment, it's tiny. That's better. Oh, we have lots of things. Oh, well, we have people asking how to spell Kheiralla's name, which I guess we won't worry about so much right now. And people noting that we only had Anton Haddad on for a while. Let me see what we have farther down here. And I guess some people are asking about the slides. Excuse me, we can put them up, I hope, afterwards so that people can look at them. We will get the slides synchronized with the talk, I'm sure, when we're editing the whole thing. Some people are having audio problems, but I had no problem. I think that went through just fine. Oh, yes, one person asked what happened to Anton Haddad. This is something you and I were talking about earlier. So perhaps you could say something about that.
Haddad is someone that we really should celebrate in the United States. We should be naming buildings for him and teaching projects. It was actually a great personal sacrifice. He had a wife and 2 children back in Lebanon that he was trying to support by being an immigrant. And he came back and spent some years in the United States and really helped to get it established on a firm basis. He did much of the early translation that had to be done and did travel on behalf of establishing the faith. But he finally had to return to his family. And it's interesting, he and the Goodall family developed a very close relationship because Ella had and Helen, after they left the Holy Land, went to Lebanon and met with his wife and children. And so the Goodall family kept a ongoing friendship and would send clothes to the kids and so forth. Haddad's brother, as I understand, came to the United States and was not sort of used the good name of his brother, Anton, to take advantage of some of the Baha'is in the United States. So that wasn't so positive. But we don't know a whole lot about what happened to him after he returned home. And you said that, and you found in your research, he passed away in 1924. I think it will take a Baha'i doing research in Lebanon to really tell us what he did after he left the United States. So
I'm pretty sure that 1924 date, believe it or not, was a photo caption. Now, as I think about it, if you look through the Baha'i worlds, I think it's in a photo caption or somewhere near a photo of him. But that's the only place I've ever seen the date of death for him. And you might want to say a little bit more about what happened to Kheiralla, Ibrahim Kheiralla, because that's really quite a dramatic story, it seems to me, about his passing and his failures to attract followers after he leaves the community.
Well, of course, the community he most affected was the Chicago community. And he set up the equivalent of a Baha'i church with himself as sort of the pastor of it in the Chicago area. It started off fairly large and very quickly dwindled. And over time, he had almost no adherents except for his two daughters. Even his son deserted him. And he sort of it became a seller of Middle Eastern paraphernalia, I guess you could say, as he sort of started off when he was in the United States. So he went back to Lebanon. He was headed back there to see one of his daughters. And as he got close to, the ship got close to Beirut, there was a boiler explosion, which ended up very badly scalding him, and he died of burn wounds. A terrible way to go. And at that point was essentially destitute and had nobody who was following him. He did make attempts to try to recontact some of the early Baha'i adherents that he had taught, and most of them had nothing to do with him. He even tried to get hold of Mrs. Hearst years later, and of course she had done with him. This is such a big story. It's actually more difficult for me to get it down to this time period, less than an hour. Normally, I like to do it over the course of a summer school where I have a number of because it's so rich. We didn't even touch upon what happened while the pilgrims were in the Holy Land, which is a wonderful story in and of itself. They were, of course, treated very special. The biggest symbolic thing that Abdu'l-Baha did was he allowed them to go into the room where Baha'u'llah was buried. And this was the first time anyone had been allowed in there other than the master and I guess people working in the room since Baha'u'llah had passed. Baha'u'llah also said that their arrival marked the end of the period of mourning for Baha'u'llah. And I think that we can't begin to appreciate how it really raised the morale of the steadfast believers in the East, because they had gone through this terrible period, first with the loss of Baha'u'llah, then the defections of so many members of the family and other people following them and breaking the covenant, and then to see this great victory that the faith had been established, not just in the United States, but through the same process, England and France, and to see the actual believers coming, it was thrilling, and really raised the morale of all the adherents in the Levant.
A couple of other questions. One person asks when Anton Haddad left America. Do you remember that?
I'd have to look it back up. I think it's like 1908 or so. It was.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think it was sooner unless he came back. I think it was like 1901 or 1902. He left before Mirza Abul Fazl left, it seems to me. And Abul Fazl left in 1904.
I will have to look at that.
Look that one up.
Yeah, it's. He was there less than 10 years. Less than 10 years, but he was there during the most critical years.
Yeah. One person asks about Margaret Bloodgood Peake and whether we have any other information about her and whether she's related to any of the Bloodgoods in New York.
She was from New York originally and then had moved to Ohio. And her daughter-in-law became a very active Baha'i. She is very much has a similar history to Mrs. True, in that she had a large number of children who died.
Huh.
And so she went through these really terrible personal tragedies. And this is probably why she was so engaged in religion, because she was not just someone who was became interested in an adherent in the Baha'i faith, but she wrote a great deal about religion. She was a speaker on the women's circuit at churches and so forth. But she had one child remaining, and that was a son, and he committed suicide.
Oh.
And so her daughter-in-law is the one who became very active, stayed very active after Mrs. Speake's passing. But she was a bloodgood from a prominent family in New York, yes. It's all in the book, and you can. I'd have to go back and reread them.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. One never remembers the details later on. Some of them, yes, some no.
Yeah.
One person was asking what you're working on now, so you might want to mention Horace Holly real quick, and we can give a plug for that talk.
I would like. That's why I was starting to say my head is currently in the 1950s with Horace Holly and what was going on at that period. I've been Horace Holly, which is my next project. I did a non-Baha'i book in the interim, by the way, but this next one is Horace, which really sort of picks up where the first book ends at World War I period, and then goes all the way through to 1960 when he passes away in the Holy Land. So it's, again, the development of the American Baha'i community, but looking at it through the life of this amazing hand of the cause. So I think that book will probably be at least 3 years away. But George Ronald's very anxious to get it out. And I have some chapters drafted, but I still have a great deal. Yeah.
Good. Heather, Paul asks whether you have an update on Robert Turner's grave in Northern California. I'm not sure what the issue is there.
I don't know anything about his.
Yeah. Heather says she read the book a while ago and very much enjoyed it. One of the moving parts for her, the most moving parts for her, was when the Getzingers first met Eastern believers in a coffee shop and Edward recognized the faithful brother of Baha'u'llah.
Yeah. That's a wonderful story. Again, I didn't get a chance to tell it because of the time constraints. When they first arrived, and as a former staff member, I so understood this. The House of Justice will tell you, don't do this, don't do that. You know, the greater needs of the faith require that when they're tearing that building down for where the lower terrace is going to be, don't go there and take pictures while they're doing it. We don't want to draw attention to what we're doing. So the master understood that if the officials in the area and the enemies of the faith in the area got wind that Westerners were there to see him, they could shut it down very easily. So the friends have been warned, don't draw attention to them. But they couldn't help themselves because they knew when the Getzingers got there that this was historic, this was momentous. So the very night they arrived, they get there about 10 o'clock at night, and rather than taking them to their hotel, they're taken to a tea house down in the old port area of Haifa, which was owned by a Baha'i and apparently was a Baha'i hangout. And it's probably 11 o'clock at night by the time they get there from going through customs and everything else. And they get into this little candlelit room, and the place is full of Persians. And so they're given tea, and then this very elderly but dignified gentleman gets up, and he's the only one who's supposed to be there. The others are trying to be cool, like, oh, I didn't really see you, but I'm looking at you from the corner of my eye, sort of thing. And so it's Abdu'l-Baha's faithful half-brother, and he's
Baha'u'llah's
faithful half-brother, and the uncle of Abdu'l-Baha, the last member of the Holy Family of that stature. Shoghi Effendi is, of course, the most important male relative, but he's a toddler. So he has sent this uncle, and he is there to officially welcome the Getzingers and is charged with letting Abdu'l-Baha know that they have arrived safely. Well, as soon as Edward sees him, he realizes he's the man he saw in his vision.
Huh.
So he has this whole double take, and it all, there are all these mystical elements to the story. This is not, as I keep saying, if the faith wasn't real, who could make it up?
Huh. Borzu asks this question. First of all, is everything that you've presented included in your book? And second, do you intend to extend your narrative further into the future to include other key figures in the evolution of the faith in the U.S.? I ask this because I am not aware of any other work that addresses this topic comprehensively as a contiguous work. So that's what Borzu says.
There's a lot more detail. I gave a tiny bit of what's in the book. And so I hope that the folks who have not read it will go back and get a copy of it. And they can also get a Kindle edition these days from Amazon. So the details are there. I think that I have covered most of the information that's available on this topic. There is much more work to be done on Ella Goodall Cooper. Much more work to be done on the Getzingers. You know, Velda Medelman's book was, I think, only a beginning. I've, in my research on Horace Holly, particularly looking at the teens and 1920s, I've run across some additional information about some of the figures in the book, but nothing that would be earth-shattering to know about them. There's some wonderful descriptions, for example, of Lua Getzinger's teaching methods that didn't in the book on Lua Getsinger. So there's more for other Baha'i scholars to do. I think that the basic story of the advent of the faith in the West is told in this book. There are other people working on the Paris Baha'i community, which is very, very important. That's partly covered in my book, how that got started, and the British Baha'i community. So I think that story will be there. I think that there's just a lot left to be told, and there's more and more new papers and information coming out. The one thing that may also hopefully be available in the future is, I understand that the Hearst family has not turned over all papers to Berkeley, which is where the
Croft Library.
The main archives for the Hearst papers. That they're keeping some in a warehouse in California. And so I hope that many of the missing things, like, for example, the archives at Berkeley do not contain anything from the Getzingers. They don't contain any of the tablets of Abdu'l-Baha. And it's possible some of those were destroyed, but it's also possible that they're being kept, but not in a way that they're available currently to the public.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember I've been in Bancroft Library and saw what was there, and there was really a lot of holes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was in touch with one researcher on William Randolph Hearst, and he had gotten a hold of Phoebe's diary. So I asked him how he did that, and it was through the Hearst family, and that's how I know about this other archives.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Marco Oliveira asks whether there are parallels between these first pilgrims and the early Christian believers in Rome and Greece.
I'm sure there are, but I think probably the stories of the friends from Iran during the early years would probably be more parallel than the Western stories. I think that certainly the early Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land would have had the same effect as the early Baha'i pilgrimages did. They greatly fortified the faith of those who went. And even though this was the very first one and was treated special, in fact, during the time of the pilgrimage itself, the participants realized that they were part of something historic. And so they were keeping notes and diaries and so forth. And fortunately, at least 4 of those diaries still exist. But within a year or so, there were other ones. The Getzingers went back, I think, about 18 months later. Other people, the Pillsbury Dodges.
Yeah,
and Laura Clifford Barney and so forth started going. And so it was fits and starts due to the political situation, but Americans started going on pilgrimage, and also people from England and the expats living in Paris. So this was very vital to the strengthening of the faith in the West, because there was nothing could compare with spending time with the Master and going.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think in the Baha'i Centenary volume published in 1944, there's a comment that before Abdu'l-Baha came to America, about 100 Americans went on pilgrimage to see him. And that's actually interesting because you're accounting for, what, 15 of those 100. So when you think about it, that's a pretty significant fraction of the total. Probably 17, 15 people, I can't remember the total number, who were on that pilgrimage party.
Well, that's the other thing that's very interesting is I think you get to 14 if you add Mrs. Peake in.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but
which is the number in God Passes By. The Guardian seems to have included Peake. Yeah,
Mrs. Peake. So the members of the Hearst pilgrimage debated whether she should be included. Ella Goodall didn't like that so much.
Yeah, well, in that sense, she was a crasher. She showed up.
Mrs. Peake brought a friend, so do we add the friend? You know, I mean.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, she brought a friend. But it was interesting, like Agnes Lane didn't get to Haifa and Akka, but she was there in Egypt. And she was taught the faith by Harriet Thornburgh on the ship back to Paris, on the way back to Paris. So, but
that's interesting.
Very interesting. So, and then Imogene Hoag accompanied the group from California all the way to Paris, but she was headed to Milan, and she only was able to go a few years later as a pilgrim. So she was kind of a peripheral part of the pilgrimage, and they saw her on the way back and so forth. So anyway, it's very interesting. It's so organic, and I just love the fact that it's predominantly women, and especially young single women. And it's interesting that most of the collective statements he makes in his Abdu'l-Baha makes in his correspondence to the group after they return, he uses female pronouns. It's almost like he considers Robert Turner and Edward and Kheiralla to not have even been there. He's addressing them. He talks to them about women and women's roles, and he brings up Mary Magdalene a lot, and also Saint Barbara. And I didn't know anything about Saint Barbara, and so checking her out, she was an early Christian who came from a prominent family. And when she refused to renounce her faith, her father turned her in to the authorities, and she was martyred because of her father. And I think that perhaps the story that he was trying to get across to these folks was the world of women at that time was the world of their families. And it was the family that was going to be the ones that would be pulling them away from this. And in fact, that is
what happened. That's very interesting. And Natalie asks, does Haddad have any descendants today who are Baha'is? Another topic we've discussed.
He had 2 children, a boy and a girl, as far as I know, and I don't know what happened to them. You said that you had heard that they had not stayed with the faith, but I don't know.
Yeah, I wrote the National Spiritual Assembly of Lebanon in the 80s, and it seems to me they wrote back and said that they were still perhaps in touch with the family in some way, but the family wasn't Baha'i. It seems to, I don't know, I can't really remember now the details of my letter, but it was something to that effect. Don says, is the story of Bolles Maxwell asking Abdu'l-Baha for her to have a child, when did that happen?
I think the best thing for him to do is to read The Maxwells of Montreal by Mrs. Nachavani. Fabulous, fabulous work. It was, decades in the making. Kanu herself wanted to write that story, and it had to be left to her friends to finish it, particularly Mrs. Nachavani. And so that story is all in The Maxwells of Montreal, and I think that occurred, well, she was born in, 1919, I think?
1909 or 1910. She was like 3 when Abdu'l-Baha visited.
Yeah, that's right. She didn't make it to 90. She was 89. And okay. So anyway, it was a couple of years before that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are all the questions that we've received. And this has been really fantastic. I'm going to have to start looking at your footnotes very closely to see where all your sources came from, because I'm intrigued by all the information that you've been able to find. This is, again, from researcher to researcher, the value of different people looking into similar topics using different sources and finding a different piece of the picture. And so I'm really very grateful that you've done this work and you've recovered all this information, that some of which was probably easy to find and some of which obviously was not. And all these different pieces of the story just keep giving us a richer and richer view of the beginnings of the faith in the West and of the role of America in the future civilization of the world. So I'm very grateful to you for offering us this talk today and of putting the book together and doing the research.
Thank you. A lot of the fun facts that I couldn't put into the narrative because it would detract from the main story are in the footnotes.
Yeah.
But, the thing that I keep coming back to and thinking about the first pilgrimage, and these were all very ordinary people. There were people like Lua who were a little, I guess we could use for Edward and Lua the words eccentric, I think would be, they were not ordinary. But
Right.
Ms. Hearst gathered around her people who were fairly ordinary, who were still very attracted to the faith. And the key was steadfastness. And how do you stay steadfast when you're the only Baha'i in a whole city?
Yeah.
When you've got your family is all against you. You don't even have the books in your own language. You
Yep.
only know a little bit about the Baha'i faith. You've had the great privilege of meeting Abdu'l-Baha. Is that enough to keep you steadfast over many decades and a lifetime?
Yep.
And so this is really, to me, the most interesting aspect of this is how did people take this gift and what did it mean to them over time?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Kathryn. Really very appreciative of this session this afternoon with you, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of people enjoying this particular video for quite a while in the future. We will, of course, have it up on our website, on our YouTube channel as soon as we can edit it and get it up. And again, Ann Corcoran also says she was very impressed by lighting the western sky and thanks you. It enhanced her experience of the book very much.